They told you monsters wear masks and hide in the dark. But the real monsters wear aprons, smile politely, and host church luncheons. In 1834 Virginia, one such monster opened her home to God while hiding hell beneath it. The farmhouse still stands. Most drive past it without a second thought, just another relic from America's forgotten past, nestled deep in the humid silence of Henrico County. But in that basement, 47 children were chained in the dark, and no one knew. No one wanted to know. They called her Mother Sullivan. To the community, she was a woman of God, soft-spoken, gracious, always helping orphans from Pennsylvania. But none of the children shared a name. None of them had relatives. And when asked where they came from, they couldn't answer because they had been taken, bought, traded, and broken. This isn't just a story of kidnapping. This is about design, the deliberate architecture, control. You're not just about to witness horror. You're going to witness the kind of evil that's practiced, perfected, and preserved across generations. This was no random act. This was a system. And like all systems, it had rules, rituals, and a hierarchy. We begin with a woman no one suspected, a wife with too many nieces from out of town, a husband with a basement 3 times larger than the house above it, and a town that turned its head every time it heard a noise it couldn't explain, because fear is a powerful silencer. You're about to enter a story buried beneath layers of polite deception, a story they try to erase from the archives of American history. But what happened in Millbrook was an anomaly. It was a glimpse of a pattern, a blueprint, one that still echoes in the shadows of modern institutions. Because once you understand how they operated in 1834, you'll start to see reflections of it all around you today. This is not entertainment. This is a warning. From the basement of a farmhouse to the depths of your own psyche, you're about to be initiated into a knowledge that rewires how you see the world. You were never meant to hear this, but now you will. Brace yourself. The descent begins now. You think you know what evil looks like, but the Sullivan basement wasn't built overnight. It was constructed stone by stone, lie by lie, under the eyes of a trusting community that mistook silence for goodness and shadows for privacy. Ezra Sullivan was no ordinary farmer. He didn't plow his land like other men. He didn't rise with the sun or gather at the local tavern. He spent his days in the soil, not above it, but beneath, expanding a basement no one was allowed to see, a labyrinth beneath the house, dug deep into the Virginian clay, with walls thicker than prison cells and doors that locked from the outside. Why would a farmer need a soundproof dungeon? Because Ezra didn't grow crops. He grew obedience, and he needed a place to raise it far from prying eyes, a place where the wailing of children could not be heard, even by God. But Ezra was not the mastermind. That role belonged to Constance Sullivan, the woman history would later call Mother. Her power was psychological. She understood how to wear the mask of virtue while practicing the rituals of control. Her weapons weren't knives or chains, they were stories. She told each child they were unwanted, that they'd been given away, that she saved them, that the world outside would eat them alive. She broke their minds before their bodies ever resisted, and it worked. For over 20 years, not a single child escaped. Not a single child cried loud enough to reach help. Why? Because they didn't believe help existed. That's the mark of deep trauma, not silence from fear, but silence from surrender. Every detail was calculated. The white clapboard house, the neatly trimmed garden, the polite smile, even the way she quoted scripture as if her chains had God's approval. Constance understood one truth better than most. If you cloak your evil in piety, people will thank you for it. The neighbors saw what they wanted to see, a godly woman doing charity. They didn't question the padlock seller. They didn't ask about the dozens of orphans no one ever met, because in Millbrook, reputation outweighed reality. And Mother Sullivan? She wore her reputation like armor, but reputations, like houses, rot from underneath. You're not hearing folklore. You're hearing the hidden mechanics of elite control, disguised in the skin of kindness. And this was just the opening chapter. The Sullivan basement wasn't discovered by accident. It was betrayed by sound, by a single muffled voice that refused to die quietly beneath the dirt. But before we get to that scream, We need to understand the structure not of the basement, but of the belief system that allowed it to exist. Virginia, a land fracture between plantation opulence and rural superstition. Religion reigned not as a spiritual compass, but as a mechanism of order. People didn't question what the preacher blessed. They didn't look too hard at the good families. And the Sullivans? They were the best kind of family. Quiet, white, charitable, and rich. That's how corruption hides inside of morality. Play no one dares interrupt. You must understand this. What happened beneath that house was not simply criminal, it was institutional. A protected system of abuse engineered to survive on silence, trust, and ritualized deception. The children arrived one by one. Some were sold handed over by desperate parents at overcrowded orphanages. Others were snatched during harsh winters, lured by food, warmth, and the false promise of a new start. But once inside that house, they ceased being individuals. They became inventory. Constance Sullivan kept ledgers, not diaries. Ledgers. Each child was assigned a number, name, age, condition, discipline notes, compliance ratings. Imagine the soul of a child reduced to margins on a page monitored, managed, modified like livestock. This wasn't impulse. This was policy. The older children were taught to subdue the younger ones. Food was conditional. Praise weaponized. There were no bedtime stories, only rules. Obedience meant warmth. Rebellion meant isolation. No one left the basement. Some grew up and were never seen again. And all the while, above ground, the community praised her. Such a generous woman. Such a devoted mother to those poor children. She made donations to the church. Hosted tea for the wives of local officials. No one noticed that every window on the lower level was permanently shuttered. Because no one wanted to notice. But evil has weight. And over time, the walls began to crack. First metaphorically, then literally. That winter, 1834, the cold was so deep it pushed sound through the floors. The screams made it to the surface. A hunter heard them. A merchant felt them through floorboards. Truth, when buried too long, starts clawing its way out. The question isn't how she hid it. The question is, how many others still do? September 9th, 1878. That was the night everything broke. 3 boys from town, Daniel Miller, age 14, his brother Eli, 12, and their friend Henry Lockhart, decided to sneak onto the Blackwood property. They're gone wrong. Childhood curiosity twisted into horror. They never made it past the tree lane. Henry Lockhart was the only one who survived. He ran into town at dawn barefoot, eyes wide, covered in blood that wasn't his. He couldn't stop screaming. His mouth foamed with spittle as he repeated the same phrase over and over. They were waiting for us. Dr. Morrison sedated him and kept him locked in the back room of the clinic for 5 days. When Henry finally calmed, he spoke of what he saw. He said the brothers weren't sleeping in their house anymore. They had moved their beds into the chapel. But they didn't lie on them. They sat upright all night, unblinking, mouths open in silent song. And behind them on the chapel wall, that same glyph Ezra painted weeks earlier was now pulsing, glowing, moving, not with light, with something inside the wall. And what lived there wasn't from this world. The 2 missing boys, Daniel and Eli, were never found. That night, 3 men from the town armed themselves with rifles and lanterns. They marched toward the Blackwood farm with purpose. One was James Patterson, whose twin daughters had died weeks earlier. Another was Benjamin Hartman, still grieving his wife. The third was Reverend Whitlock. They never spoke publicly about what they saw. Only Whitlock ever wrote it down in a letter to Kansas City Diocese sealed for over a century. The letter reads, "We found them kneeling before the altar, not praying, but feeding. Their mouths were open, their eyes rolled back. Their skin glowed from beneath like lanterns made of thin flesh. Something hung above the altar, not flesh, not spirit. It knew we were there, and it showed us things I cannot write." 2 days later, Reverend Whitlock resigned his post. 1 month after that, he took his own life. The church burned down a year later, but not by accident. The Methodist elders gathered one final time. They burned Every page mentioning the Blackwood name, ripped it from sermons, tore from birth ledgers, scratched it off cemetery stones. They believed, somehow, that forgetting them was a kind of exorcism, but it was already too late, because the brothers were changing. Again, by the autumn equinox, even the land began to reject them. The wheat stopped growing near the chapel. The soil turned black, wet, veined. Birds avoided the property entirely. Even flies wouldn't land on the farmhouse walls. And yet, the Blackwood brothers thrived. They no longer wore shoes. They no longer bathed. They walked barefoot to the tainted soil, whispering to themselves in perfect unison. Ezra no longer spoke at all. But when he looked at you, it felt like your memories were being read. People began reporting dreams about him. The same dream. You're in the chapel. You're lying on the altar, and Ezra stands over you, holding a book that bleeds when he turns its pages. Every dream ended the same way. He speaks a word you've never heard before. And when you wake up, you remember it, in your own voice. These weren't just dreams. They were rituals. Because the brothers weren't praying anymore. They were converting, not people, but minds, changing the thoughts of the entire town, one dream at a time. And then, something worse happened. On October 3rd, Dr. Morrison disappeared, gone without a trace. His notes, however, remained, pages torn, ink smudged, but still legible. His final entry? Their blood contains non-human proteins, iridescent under light, alive, self-replicating. I took a sample. I should not have. My thoughts are no longer mine. There is a second voice, and it is older than time. That same day, a Kansas State Medical Board official arrived unannounced in Cedar Ridge, sent after a string of increasingly panicked letters from Dr. Morrison. He interviewed townsfolk, examined the sealed well, and approached the Blackwood farm. He was never seen again. 2 days later, 4 men in black suits arrived from Topeka. They didn't wear badges. They didn't give names. They confiscated Dr. Morrison's files, paid off the local sheriff, and issued a quarantine on the Blackwood property. But what they really did was build a fence, 10 feet high, barbed wire, encircling the entire farm. No warnings, no signage, just a silent barrier around the brothers and whatever they were becoming. And then they left. The town was told to forget, to say nothing, to pretend the Blackwoods had never come. But the people never forgot, because the fence didn't keep the brothers in. It kept something else from getting out. By November, the Blackwoods were no longer recognized as men. They had become something the townspeople whispered about. The 4 that sleep standing. They hadn't been seen eating. They hadn't been seen sleeping. And yet their bodies remained strong, untouched by time or decay. What remained behind that barbed wire fence wasn't a farm. It was a sanctum, a domain. And in the heart of it, the chapel, once a symbol of piety, had become a throne room for something ancient. One night, Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith whose son had been healed by Josiah, claimed he heard singing from across the prairie. Not music, not melody, but a perfect harmonic vibration, like glass on the edge of shattering. He wasn't the only one. Across Cedar Ridge, dozens of people reported the same thing. Voices that weren't voices, resonating inside their bones. Infants cried for hours. Dogs howled until they bled. And church bells rang on their own. The town gathered for an emergency meeting. Men armed with rifles. Women clutching rosaries. But there was no plan. Because how do you plan against what you don't understand? Against what might not even be alive? And then the storm came. November 9th, 1878. No clouds. No wind. No rain. Just light. Flashes of blue-white fire tore across the sky directly above the Blackwood property. For 2 hours, the air shimmered with ozone. The ground trembled, as if beneath the weight of something descending. When it ended, every lantern in town went dark. Every clock stopped, and every mirror cracked down the center. Reverend Whitlock's abandoned home was found with every page of his Bible torn out, except one. Leviticus 10, verses 1-2. And fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. 3 days later, the fence around the Blackwood farm had changed. It wasn't rusted anymore. It was new, stronger, barbed shaped like sigils. The kind Uzziah once carved into the chapel pews. No one had rebuilt it. It had rebuilt itself. And inside the fence, movement. But no one saw the brothers. Only their shadows, walking the land as if the flesh no longer mattered. And the land, once black and dead, had begun to bloom again. But what grew there wasn't wheat. It pulsed. It shimmered. It watched. The children were taken to a temporary shelter in Richmond, where doctors, priests, and local officials tried to assess the damage. But how do you diagnose the soul? Physically, they could be clean, clothed, fed. But internally, they were shattered clocks. Time had stopped ticking inside them years ago. Some had forgotten their real names. Others spoke in whispers, even when no one told them to. A few refused to sleep on beds, choosing instead to curl up beneath tables, instinctively seeking confinement. Because when a cage is all you've known, freedom feels like disorientation. What happened next is even more disturbing than what came before. The state of Virginia did not charge Constance Sullivan with murder, nor kidnapping, not even cruelty. The legal system had no language, no precedent for what they found beneath that house. Because what she did wasn't seen as impossible, just inconvenient. They labeled her mentally unwell, committed her to a sanatorium in Fredericksburg, where she lived another 14 years, fed by the state, treated kindly by doctors who called her mother as a joke. Ezra died within months of the arrest, found in his cell with a Bible pressed to his chest and dirt under his fingernails as if trying to claw his way back to the basement. The surviving children? Scattered. Some were placed with families who couldn't understand why they stared at walls or screamed at night. Others disappeared into the orphanage system, again, the very same one that sold some of them in the first place. No memorial was built. No public apology was issued. The Sullivan farmhouse was eventually sold to a family from Delaware who knew nothing of its history. The basement was filled in with concrete by the new owners. And the town of Millbrook? It moved on, because forgetting is easier than remembering when memory demands accountability. You need to ask yourself why. Why a case involving dozens of abused children, a basement dungeon, and nearly 100 victims never made it into history books? Why the only surviving documentation was buried in a county archive, labeled as a domestic disturbance? Because when truth threatens the system doesn't argue. It erases. And if they erase this, what else did they bury beneath the floorboards of American memory? Millbrook, Virginia, was never the same after the Sullivan case, but not for the reasons you'd expect. No public outrage, no reckoning, no soul-searching, just silence. The local paper printed 3 articles, 1 editorial, then nothing. People stopped saying the name Sullivan. The house became that property on the ridge. Children were told never go near it, not because of what had happened, but because it made adults uncomfortable. That's the psychology of complicity. Not everyone is evil, but most people are terrified of truth that demands action. And the truth was this: Millbrook had always known. Maybe not in exact detail, not the number of children, not the chains, but they knew something was wrong. They heard screams late at night. They saw wagons come and go with no explanation. Some even claimed they'd seen bruises on the children during Sunday services. But they looked away, because confronting evil means confronting your own inaction. And nobody wants to be the person who should have done something. A reverend named Calvin Stokes gave a sermon 2 weeks after the basement was uncovered. His words were calm, controlled. Let us not dwell on horror, he said. Let us focus on healing. The Lord sees all, and his justice is eternal. The subtext was clear. Let this die quietly. But one man refused to let it go. Deputy Marcus Webb, the same man who found the cellar, began compiling a private record. He interviewed the surviving children, drew maps of the basement's layout, took notes from the ledgers, and traced the names signed in the so-called adoption letters. What he discovered rattled him more than the cellar ever did. Most of those children had never been adopted. They had been purchased. Webb found payment records, gold, land deeds, even livestock exchanged for custody. The buyers? Not all were local. Some were judges, doctors, out-of-state clergymen. Well-connected men with clean reputations. It wasn't just a prison. It was a network. The Sullivans weren't mad. They were middlemen, which raises the question, who were they working for? And how many other basements were never found? Because the Sullivan case doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a pattern. And the pattern isn't ancient. It's ongoing. Webb's findings were never published. Not officially. His notes never made it into court records. And his warnings weren't welcomed not by the mayor, not by the sheriff's office, not even by the press. He was told to let it lie. He didn't. In a letter to his cousin, a preacher, in Kentucky, he wrote, "What we found under the Sullivan house was just a symptom. The disease is older, widespread, hidden in plain sight. These children weren't just lost. They were taken, processed, broken for someone else's purpose." That letter, dated March 2nd, 1835, was one of the last things Webb ever wrote. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. His home was found unlocked, his journal missing. The only thing left behind was a burned page in his fireplace, a list of names half-charred, the ink still legible on one. Judge R. T. Elbridge Richmond. And just like that, the only man willing to map the network vanished. His disappearance was ruled voluntary relocation due to emotional strain. No investigation. No body. Just gone. What's worse, his cousin, the preacher, tried to come forward. He brought the letter to a district official. Within days, his chapel caught fire. The official who took the letter claimed he'd never seen it. Erased again. Over the next few years, whispers spread of similar homes in Georgia, Missouri, Pennsylvania. Always the same structure, rural, religious overtones, private, reformed shelters for unwanted children, and a leader, often a woman seen as strict but pious. There were reports of strict regimens, of isolation, of silence. But without basements like Millbrook's, there was no proof, just patterns. The Sullivan method wasn't unique. It was a template, a system built on plausible deniability, spiritual language, and bureaucratic blindness. You could sell it as salvation, and most people would look the other way, especially if the children weren't ours, especially if they came from unfit mothers or the streets or the poorhouses, because once society labels a child as disposable, anything that happens to them can be justified, and that's the terrifying genius of how this operated. It didn't hide in shadows. It hid in virtue, behind the mask of charity, behind the mask of care. Step carefully now, because this is the part where most turn back. Not because they don't believe, but because they do. The spiral at the center of the Blackwood property isn't just a formation. It's a recording device. But not for sound, not for images, for souls. In 1982, a private team of geophysicists funded by a think tank under Stanford Research Institute attempted core drilling at the spiral center. They never reached bedrock, because the deeper they drilled, the less resistance they found, as if the earth beneath the chapel had been hollowed. After 93 feet, the drill stopped making contact. It just fell. The rig collapsed in on itself. 3 men died. And on the final reel of seismic readout, there were no earth layers, no shale, no limestone, no granite. Only a frequency, a tone. But this wasn't a sound made by the machine. It was broadcasting back. One technician described it as, like something was listening. And then it replied, with my mother's voice. She'd been dead 20 years. After that incident, the land was seized by a newly formed agency, Office of Temporal Stabilization, a division of the U.S. government that does not officially exist. Their first act? Covering the spiral with an artificial grain field, sensors embedded beneath, motion detectors on every border, satellite surveillance from above. But what are they watching for? Not who enters, who leaves, because the Blackwood brothers were never buried. No grave markers, no death certificates. Yet their DNA appeared in a 2021 Kansas State Prison database. All 4 profiles. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, Abel. Perfect matches. And all tied to one inmate. A boy born in 2004. Raised in a foster system. No medical history. No parents. Except in his dreams, he speaks fluent Proto-Sumerian, and he draws the chapel. Exactly. In detail. Stone for stone. When questioned by state psychologists, he simply said, "I was born here, but not yet. Not yet, because the door doesn't close forward. It closes backward. Time itself is bleeding at the edges. That spiral in the grass? It isn't a scar. It's a clock. And when it strikes midnight again, the brothers won't return. They'll awaken because they never left. They just sank beneath, then stepped down. But understand, this descent isn't physical. You're not walking into a basement. You're slipping beneath consensus reality. And once your eyes adjust to what lies there, you will never see this world the same way again. The spiral beneath the chapel isn't a staircase. It's a filter, one that strips away illusion. That's why no satellite can map it. That's why digital recordings glitch, why compasses spin, why even memory fractures near the site. Because the moment you cross into its radius, something happens that modern science still has no name for. You become visible to them. Who are they? Not demons, not aliens, not spirits. Those are words we made up to protect ourselves. What came through the Blackwoods, what changed them, is older than any of our myths. They are called, in the only language that fits, the witnesses. They do not think. They observe. But what they observe, they change. And what they change, they own. In 1993, a Soviet defector named Anatoly Venediktov fled to the U.S. with a single item in his possession, a golden disc, etched with concentric spirals and symbols matching the ones on the Blackwood altar. He claimed it had been recovered from a Siberian dig site known only as K Sector 7, a mirror location to the Kansas spiral. According to Anatoly, the structures are identical, the atmospherics, identical, the loss of time, the bleed-throughs, the sleep chanting. It's not a site. It's a network. These are nodes in a lattice that spans the earth, buried beneath what we call reality. The witnesses, they aren't here to visit. They're here to harvest. But not your flesh, not your blood. They want your obedience. They erode belief layer by layer until you kneel willingly, until you question nothing, until your memories belong to them. And that's the secret behind the Blackwood brothers. They weren't chosen. They were volunteers, men of unshakable faith, men willing to bleed for an idea so sacred they mistook possession for a purpose. And now, through them, the witnesses study us, using the spiral as a lens, watching who looks too long, who asks the wrong questions, who follows the story to its bitter, blinding end. So I ask you, before we go deeper, are you still watching? Are you still here because you're brave or because something in you already belongs to them? Beneath the chapel, there is no light, not because it's dark, but because light refuses to enter. The Blackwoods didn't build the chapel to worship in. They built it to hide what was already there. Stone by stone, prayer by prayer, they cloaked an entrance to something that does not sleep, to something that waits. Local legends whisper of it long before 1878. The Osage called the land the Mushkiew, the place that watches back. Even they wouldn't settle near it. No hunting, no travel, no fire, just offerings, skulls of deer left in circles, bundles of teeth wrapped in black cloth, always facing the eastern wind. So when the Blackwoods came, faith drunk, brilliant, disciplined, they didn't discover the chapel site. They were summoned to it. Josiah knew. You can see it in his journals, those not confiscated by the state. In one entry, scrawled in frantic, almost trembling script, he writes, "It sings through the stone. It showed me a face made of hunger. It does not speak. It uses my thoughts like doors. I am not praying anymore. I am remembering." Remembering what? That's the true horror, because this isn't new. The witnesses didn't arrive in 1878. They've always been here. It's us who arrived. And what we call history is just how long we've survived without noticing. The face beneath the chapel was described by only one man who saw it and lived. A geologist named Victor Salazar, sent in 2002 as part of a private academic team studying geomagnetic inversion sites. They descended beneath the artificial chapel ruin, past the fake substructures, into what he described as an impossibly smooth, circular chamber like the inside of a throat. On the far wall, half submerged in the living stone, a face, 12 eyes, no mouth, each eye blinking at different times. And behind the stone, he said, was breathing, not echo, breathing. He left the team, fled across 3 states, spent the next 10 years in a monastery, silent, isolated, and refusing to ever speak the name Blackwood again. Before his death in 2013, he broke his silence only once. He said, "The eyes don't see the world. They see the way God sees you. And if you're not who you pretend to be, it calls you home. Home. That's what the spiral is. That's what the chapel is. That's what the Blackwood brothers built. Not a church, not a house, but a mirror. And once you've looked into it, it remembers you." In 1842, a young woman named Cora Bell escaped from one of the lesser-known homes affiliated with the Aurelian Trust, a place called the House of Still Waters, hidden in the hills outside Charleston, West Virginia. She was 16, thin, barefoot, covered in whip scars. She showed up at a trading post nearly 30 miles away, half-starved and unable to speak for hours. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if language itself had been beaten out of her and clawed its way back. What she described matched the Sullivan basement in terrifying detail. Children assigned numbers instead of names. Night cages, used for punishment underground compartments, so tight they could only sit. Daily cleansing rituals involving cold water and recitations from a twisted scripture rewritten by the house matron, a woman known only as Mother Elta. Cora had no family. She'd been sold by a drunken uncle to the Sisters of Correction for $5 and a bottle of gin. The trading post owner, a man named Isaac Dent, did something no one else had dared. He wrote her testimony down, word for word. Then he sent copies hand-transcribed to local newspapers, churches, and even the state governor. What happened next? The House of Still Waters was burned to the ground, but not by the authorities, by its own caretakers. 3 days after the story hit the local paper, the building was found in ash. No arrests, no records recovered, no surviving adults. The only thing left behind was a single sign scorched, but still hanging from the front gate, "Purity through pain." Cora Bell disappeared shortly after. Some say she was placed into private care. Others believe she was taken again silenced, vanished. But one of her testimonies survived. Dent's grandson kept the original notes hidden in a false bottom box, discovered generations later by a genealogist researching Civil War families. In Cora's words, "We didn't scream after a while. They told us God wouldn't hear us, that the pain was proof we were being made clean, that we were the rot they had to burn out. One girl died from it. They said she was chosen." That line has haunted historians ever since. She was chosen. Chosen for what? To die? Or to serve something deeper, something sacred to these people? Because one thing's becoming clear. This wasn't just about control. It was about sacrifice. Sacrifice. It's a word we like to confine to the past, to ancient altars, dead religions, the stuff of myth. But what if it never ended? What if it simply changed form hidden behind robes, rituals, and the language of charity? By the mid-1800s, rumors began to circulate among small-town clergy in Virginia and North Carolina. Whispers of a doctrine known only by a chilling name, the doctrine of severance. It appeared nowhere in official scripture. No church would publicly claim it. Yet fragments surface in letters, in confessions, in secret ledgers from institutions tied to the Aurelian Trust. The doctrine's core belief? That moral weakness is inherited, and that purity can only be restored by separating the child from their inherited rot, not just physically, but spiritually. Hence, severance. Not just a removal from family, but the erasure of identity. New names, new birthdays, new theology. Children weren't rescued. They were rewritten. And those who resisted, they were classified as offerings. One recovered document dated 1839 from a facility called Graceful Reformatory references 3 offerings this season. It describes them in chilling detachment. 2 males, approximate age 9 to 11, failed the obedience regimen, placed into Chamber B. One female, 14, displayed disruptive resistance. Scheduled for quiet washing on Sunday. The term quiet washing appears repeatedly in old logs from these institutions. Modern historians believe it was code for death by controlled drowning staged as baptism gone wrong. One chapel basement in Georgia still bears the markings: iron rings in the stone floor, water channels built into the walls, a narrow drain at the center, leading nowhere. These weren't isolated bad apples or rogue cults. This was systemic, structured, sanctified, and it went all the way up. Records show that 2 senators and 1 Supreme Court justice between 1825 and 1855 donated to these homes. One was even on the board of the Aurelian Trust. Their names are enshrined in public buildings to this day. The same men who wrote America's laws funded the quiet burial of children in the name of moral order. You weren't supposed to find this. You were supposed to believe it all burned down with time. But ash doesn't lie. And beneath that ash are bones. And beneath the bones, something worse. In the fall of 1851, a railroad crew digging near the abandoned Gracewood Reformatory struck something unexpected. Not stone, not wood, but rows of bones, small, uniform, stacked deliberately. At first, they thought it was an old graveyard, but the arrangement was too precise. Each skeleton had its arms crossed over the chest. Skulls were placed on woven mats of dried reeds. And most disturbing of all, every skull bore the same marking: a cross carved directly into the forehead bone, not with a chisel, with a blade. The site was sealed. Officially, the report vanished. The crew was relocated, and the land was sold to a holding company owned by a former Aurelian Trust director. But one man kept notes, a foreman named Elias Griggs. His private journal, discovered in 1974 by his descendants, described what he saw that day in horrific clarity. They were children, all of them. Couldn't be more than 10, 11 years old. Some bones still had scraps of linen, a few with leather cuffs still attached. We found 42 skulls, every one marked. I told the sheriff. He told me to forget, said the land was consecrated. Consecrated, not a crime scene, a sacred site. Griggs left Virginia shortly after, never returned. But he took something with him, a rusted iron pendant found in the dirt, shaped like a sun with 13 rays, each tipped with a small cut like dripping blood. The same symbol was later found on the cover of a burned ledger tied to the Sullivan estate. 13 rays. 13 houses funded by the trust. 13 offerings each year, if Monroe's recovered numbers are accurate. It was a calendar of sacrifice, structured, ritualized, hidden beneath the polite veneer of charity and discipline, all sanctioned by the wealthiest families in America's founding generation. And where'd the bodies go? Some, like those near Gracewood, were buried in ritual mass graves. Others, according to an 1854 letter found in the Sullivan attic, were dispersed through the fire, burned in underground kilns to release the stain. Yes, they built furnaces, not for warmth, for cleansing, for disposal. And what they destroyed was more than just life. They destroyed evidence of a system so depraved, so calculated, that even now, in the age of reason and records, it remains unspoken. Because if this is true, then America was never just founded on liberty. It was founded on secrecy. By winter of 1855, the Sullivan estate had become silent but not abandoned. Locals noticed signs, a single lamp flickering in the upper window, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, even though the family was supposedly away. Strange sounds at night, chains rattling, children singing hymns in unison, then suddenly stopping. A local blacksmith, Harold Finch, claimed he saw a figure dragging a sack across the orchard field behind the house, something struggling inside it. He told the town constable, who simply said, "Don't speak of Sullivans, not if you want your daughter to stay healthy." By then, stories of Sullivan fever had already begun spreading. Children from nearby farms waking at night, eyes bloodshot, whispering things they shouldn't know, names of long-dead members of the trust. Some began carving symbols into their school desks. One girl etched a full map of the Sullivan basement into her bedroom wall. She'd never been there. When her father burned the room, she stood outside smiling, repeating the same phrase. I was under. I remember the bell. That phrase, under the bell, would appear in dozens of later testimonies. It referred to the deep chamber beneath the Sullivan estate, where a massive cast-iron church bell was said to hang not to call for service, but for initiation. If the bell rang, it meant a child had passed the severance. If it rang twice, it meant one had not and would be offered. But no adult ever admitted to ringing it. No record of the bell appears in state documents, and yet its sound was heard by hundreds. One Civil War diary from 1861, written by a Union soldier stationed 10 miles out, reads, Midnight, heard a bell, deep and long, but no town nearby. Locals say it's the Sullivan ghost bell, that it only rings when a child's soul is taken. Soul taken. Not died, not killed, taken. That's when researchers like Monroe started asking the question everyone else avoided. Was this just a system of abuse and cruelty? Or was it religion? Because if the bell was real, and if the stories are consistent across multiple towns, decades, and generations, then something was being fed. And what was being fed wasn't just power or control. It was something older, something waiting beneath. They called it the hollowing, not in official texts, not in sermons or doctrine, but in whispered warnings passed down through the Appalachian Hills, especially among midwives, grave diggers, and the few surviving orphans of the Trust shadow. The hollowing referred to a state beyond death, a ritual absence, not a person killed, but a person emptied. And the root of it all was sound. Multiple survivors, most of them now anonymous or pseudonymed in historical records, spoke of the bell in the basement of the Sullivan estate. But it wasn't just a bell. It was an instrument of separation. The notes were described as not heard with the ears, but felt in the chest like a vibration that passed through the spine and made the limbs go numb. One survivor, a man institutionalized in 1894, wrote in his journal, The bell does not ring. The bell speaks. When it calls, the child answers. You don't remember walking. You just wake up in the hollow room, and you're not yours anymore. That phrase, not yours anymore, appears in dozens of similar accounts. It wasn't hypnosis. It wasn't fear. It was submission. And the Sullivan family weren't the only ones conducting this ritual. A diagram recovered from a hidden panel behind the Sullivan Library fireplace drawn in red ink on calfskin shows 12 other houses arranged in a perfect circle around the 13th. The Sullivan estate. At the center, a hole, not symbolic, physical, described as the listening pit. A chamber lined with smooth stone, so acoustically tuned that even a whisper inside it returns as thunder. That chamber has never been found. But several civilian Conservation Corps workers in the 1930s reported finding a sealed shaft near the estate ruins, overgrown, lined with black stones, and covered with an iron grate that buzzed slightly if you stood on it too long. It was buried again. Some say by order of a local bishop. Others say by the descendants of the Trust, now operating under new names, behind new institutions, charities, reform centers, even adoption agencies. Because here's the horrifying truth. The hollowing never ended. It was just refined, modernized, sanitized, and now it doesn't need a bell. It only needs consent. A child signed over, a paper signed, a ritual disguised as healing, and somewhere deep beneath it all something still listens. The last official structure tied to the Sullivan estate burned in 1903, a barn used for grain, supposedly. When it collapsed into ash, townspeople found nothing that suggested farming. No tools, no seeds, no plow tracks. Instead, beneath the floorboards, they uncovered something far more disturbing. A pit of teeth. Human. Small. Filed. Roughly 2,000 were cataloged before the sheriff ordered the site sealed. No arrests. No further excavations. The barn's ashes were buried under concrete and declared non-historical by the Virginia Historical Society as suspicious, ruling given the pressure from Richmond. But someone took photographs. And one image leaked in 1982, a sepia-toned photo of the teeth arranged in the shape of a Sun 13 rays, once again at the center of which was a burnt iron medallion, the same sun drip symbol. Again, that same year, a doctoral thesis at Columbia was quietly pulled from the university archive. Its topic? Subterranean ritual sites of the Southern elite, 1800 to 1900. The student who wrote it, Anna K. Llewellyn, disappeared 3 months later. Her advisor claimed she transferred to a monastery in Greece, but her sister received one final postcard, no return address, with only 4 words written. They're still beneath us. That wasn't a metaphor. From the 1970s to the 1990s, multiple independent urban explorers, geologists, and rogue historians began mapping sub-basements under several former Aurelian Trust properties. What they found were not just basements, but networks. Tunnels, chambers, and stone corridors, some leading nowhere, others terminating in massive circular rooms with acoustically perfect domes. One such room, beneath the defunct St. Meloris orphanage, had 7 pedestals arranged in a circle. The floor was stained. The air burned to breathe. On the ceiling, a fresco, painted in blood tones, black and red and dark gold, depicting figures with no eyes, kneeling before a radiant hole, and above them written in Latin, Vocare per filios, to call through the children. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about discipline. It was invocation. And if the Sullivan family was the 13th pillar, then their role wasn't just custodial. It was central, a conduit, a gate. And the children? They weren't victims. They were keys. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly every surviving document connected to the Sullivan estate had either vanished or been absorbed into private collections. But one cache escaped. In 1929, during renovations at a Catholic seminary in Baltimore, a carpenter found a sealed wooden crate tucked inside a wall. It had no name, only a brand burned into the lid. 13. Inside were ritual transcripts, dozens of handwritten pages yellowed brittle, written in a careful, educated hand. Each labeled with dates, child initials, and a notation of the outcome. M.A. age 9, initial refusal, bell rung twice, entered the hollow. L.J. age 10, full submission, vessel confirmed, marked. Yes, age 6, non-compliant. Dispose and fire, no sound returned. This wasn't fiction. This was a ledger. One of the transcripts dated October 1834, just days before the Sullivan estate was raided, contains a full description of the chamber of return. It was not a cell. It was a sanctum, circular, lined with mirrors and iron. And at its center, a stone altar, blackened by heat, encircled with children's shoes. But what they feared most wasn't the chamber. It was the voice. Multiple entries refer to a whisperer, a presence that spoke once the bell was struck, not in words, but in sensations. Pain, cold, emptiness. One line repeats throughout. It asks without asking. Those who answer were described as cut, cleaved, or opened, not physically, spiritually. They came back quiet, slow, and with eyes that didn't blink. One boy, age 11, is recorded as having delivered the line, an apparent reference to verbal prophecy. He spoke 39 words in the dead dialect of Etruscan, a language he had no way of knowing. The priest who recorded it later resigned and disappeared into the hills of West Virginia. But the most chilling note of all, it grows louder each year. Soon, the hollow will no longer be necessary. Soon, all shall hear. That was written in 1834. Now consider this. Why have mass disappearances been increasing again in rural Virginia? Why were 2 modern orphanage fires in 1997 and 2011 both ruled accidents despite missing children? Why do modern survivors still describe a sound not from outside, but from inside their own heads? Because a hollowing is no longer confined to chambers or basements. Now it's everywhere. And all it takes is a child no one will miss. The final child to escape the Sullivan estate before the fire was a girl known only by her initials, R.E. She was found in 1835 wandering along the edge of the Shenandoah woods, barefoot, bleeding from the ears, unable to speak. Locals took her in, thinking she'd been attacked by wolves. But when the town physician examined her, what he found was far worse. She had no injuries, no physical trauma, but she refused to make eye contact. She refused to eat, and she kept pointing to her throat, not like it hurt, but like it wasn't hers anymore. When finally coaxed into speaking weeks later, she said one sentence. The voices live on the floor. And then silence for years. But here's what makes Ari's case different. In 1859, at the age of 31, she was institutionalized in a women's sanitarium under a false name. She developed a compulsion, drawing elaborate geometric patterns on the walls and floor of her room, using blood, ash, and dirt, the same sun drip symbol, over and over. Then, during a thunderstorm in October that year, she vanished from a locked room. Only her drawings remained. But on the ceiling, scrawled in something none of the staff could identify, not blood, not charcoal, but something like grease mixed with salt, was a message. Not taken. Sent. That one phrase sent modern occult scholars into a frenzy when the record surfaced in 1994. Not taken. Sent. That rewrote everything. It suggested not just survival, but collaboration. That some children weren't merely victims, they were initiates, agents, messengers. And if Ari sent herself, then she wasn't escaping the Sullivan basement. She was delivering something from it. And it didn't stop there. In 2007, an underground forum dedicated to forbidden architecture leaked drone footage of a derelict mansion outside of Charlottesville long rumored to be the final surviving trust house. The footage revealed a subterranean vault, sealed with iron doors covered in claw marks on the inside. On the wall, Ari's symbol, fresh. And in the center of the room, atop a cracked stone pedestal, lay 7 small teeth, clean, white, and arranged in a perfect sunburst, just like before. Something or someone is still performing the rituals, still answering the bell. Only now, there's no need for a basement, because the system has been externalized, digitized, legalized, institutionalized. The trust methods haven't vanished. They've just been rebranded. If you followed this far, then you already know. This was never just about the Sullivan family. Not really. Their estate, their rituals, the basement, the chained children, these were symptoms. Visible eruptions of a much older, deeper infection woven into bones of American power. It began with bloodlines. It matured into systems. And now, it operates as culture. What began in secret chambers now wears the mask of progress. Adoption initiatives, behavioral correction centers, philanthropic youth programs. Look closer and you'll find Aurelian fingerprints in all of them. Not literal, but ritual. Designs that mirror the original circle of 13. Hierarchies that require absolute submission. And environments designed not to nurture, but to weaken, to create emptiness. Because that's the core of the hollowing. Not just silence, but removal. Not discipline, but preparation. Every child processed through the old trust system was being shaped not for salvation, but for occupation. An empty room is easy to decorate. An empty child is easy to fill. And it gets worse. Because now we know Ari wasn't the last. In 2019, an independent investigative team traced a string of underground facilities across Appalachia, many disguised as storm shelters or mining tunnels. In one, they found something chilling. A living child, around 8 years old, clean, clothed, and alert, sitting in a chair inside a soundproof concrete room. No windows, no lights, only one object in the room, a small iron bell. When asked who brought her there, she replied, "I walked here. I was called." Who called her? She just smiled and said, "You'll hear it too. Everyone will." The team fled. 2 members have since committed suicide. The footage was destroyed, or so we're told. But it doesn't matter anymore, because it's already begun. You've seen it. You've felt it. The rising tide of soullessness. The engineered collapse of family, memory, roots. The endless flood of disoriented, disconnected youth ready to be filled. That wasn't accidental. That was ritual. And now, the final truth. The Sullivan house may have burned, but its blueprint survived, passed from hand to hand. family to family, sealed behind philanthropic smiles and glittering promises. And somewhere, even now, the bell rings, not in the basement, not underground, but in the minds of the forgotten. Listen carefully, because if you can't hear it, you've already been marked.